On September 17, 1963, Lee Oswald applied for a Mexican tourist visa. After JFK's assassination, the FBI, with the help of Mexican authorities, identified every person who had applied for Mexican entry papers on September 17th, except one. The FBI reported they could not locate the record of the cardholder immediately preceding Oswald, number 24084. The official story will change often, and innumerable lies will continue about the Mexico City trip to this day. Years later, that tourist visa card will accidentally actually be identified. It belonged to William Charles Gaudet, a CIA agent for over 20 years, specializing in Latin America, and who published a Latin American newspaper as part of his CIA activities. Oswald was in Mexico City in late September and early October of 1963. During his one-week stay, he supposedly tried to obtain visas from the Cuban Consulate and Soviet embassy. After Oswald failed to get the visas, CIA intercepts showed that someone impersonated him in phone calls made to the Soviet embassy and the Cuban consulate, and linked Oswald to a known KGB assassin, Valery Kostakov, whom the CIA and FBI had been following for several years. The craziness will begin almost immediately after JFK's assassination on November 22, 1963. Within hours, the CIA station in Mexico City will identify Oswald, but send back to the U.S. a picture and voice recordings that clearly are not Lee Oswald. By midnight on the day of the assassination, the CIA and Hoover's FBI will realize that they are in trouble. An imposter has clearly been identified as impersonating Oswald at a level that can cause wars to start. What was going on? Let's start with some of the facts we can be sure about. On September 26, 1963, Lee Oswald was driven by car by someone not identified to Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, Mexico, between 1:30 and 2 p.m. From Nuevo Laredo, he traveled to Mexico City aboard bus 516 on the Flecha Roja bus line. Bus 516 arrived in Mexico City at 10 a.m. on September 27th. Within an hour, Oswald checked in at the Hotel del Comercio, located 4 blocks from the bus terminal. Oswald remained in Mexico City until the morning of October 2, 1963, when he returned to the U.S. by bus back to Nuevo Laredo and then by Greyhound to Dallas. Before we get into the tangled web of half-truths and outright deceit that will be told to the American people about what Oswald did during his week in Mexico City, let's look at the big picture. 3 questions need to be answered. 1. What did Lee Oswald think he was doing in Mexico City? 2. What did the CIA actually hope to accomplish by Oswald's trip to Mexico City? And 3. What happened to panic the agency so much that it would send Oswald imposter photos and voice to the FBI and begin a string of lies that continue to present? First, what did Lee Oswald think he was doing in Mexico City? This is the most difficult question to answer by far, and by far the very least important, because he could have been told anything by his CIA handlers, and he certainly had no idea what purpose his actions were really about. Could Oswald have been told he was setting the stage for really defecting to Cuba or back to the Soviet Union later? Who knows? What really matters is what was Oswald really doing in Mexico City for the CIA, even though he had no knowledge of his real mission. We need to set the stage. Oswald had spent the summer of 1963 living and working in New Orleans, Louisiana. Most of that time he spent with Guy Bannister, the former FBI station chief in Chicago and assistant police chief in New Orleans. Oswald had returned from the Soviet Union after his stint as a fake defector clearly was going nowhere. He had been identified as a spy by Soviet intelligence immediately and sent to work in an electronics factory in Minsk, where he could be watched and where he could do no harm. After a stint working at classified intelligence mapmaker Jaeger Chiles Stovall, Oswald was assigned to assist Bannister by visiting college campuses, recruiting for intelligence services, and assisting the two major anti-Castro Cuban groups in the New Orleans area. This included storing arms at Bannister's offices and distributing arms to anti-Castro Cubans trading at Lake Pontchartrain. Oswald also pretended to be pro-Castro to gain intelligence, even starting a Fair Play for Cuba committee chapter in New Orleans, of which he was the only member. Many people are aware Oswald was observed handing out fake pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba handbills, mistakenly stamped with Bannister's own office address, 544 Camp Street, in the heart of New Orleans intelligence community addresses. Oswald was also seen accompanying CIA assets Clay Shaw and David Ferry in Clinton and Jackson, Louisiana that summer. What many don't know is Oswald's increasing association with the most violent of the anti-Castro Cuban groups that summer of 1963. The House Select Committee on Assassinations nailed it exactly. The most violent of the anti-Castro Cubans were under the direct control of the CIA from their Miami headquarters. Oswald realized how militant these groups were, and by all accounts, became aware of plots to assassinate Kennedy as payback for the Bay of Pigs, payback that was being encouraged by Dulles, Angleton, and a faction of the CIA at the highest levels. Lee Oswald was being squeezed on two sides. He was doing his patriotic duty and helping anti-Castro Cuban groups in paramilitary training, but by infiltrating the most violent of these anti-Castro Cubans, he also learned of assassination planning. That's a lot to deal with for a 24-year-old. Oswald was a paid FBI informant, so he did have an outlet for his information, and probably received instruction from the FBI to continue his undercover work to infiltrate legitimate assassination attempts. All this while still supporting anti-Castro groups in their overall mission. It is more than probable that Oswald saved John Kennedy's life in Chicago 3 weeks before Dallas. Hoover reported a tip from an informant named Lee about a four-man hit team of dark-complected men who would shoot the president with high-powered rifles from an office building overlooking the president's motorcade route on his way from O'Hare Airport to Soldier Field. 2 of the men were taken into custody, but with 2 possible assassins still operating, the president's trip was called off at the very last minute, even after the press plane had already left.
The setup with a disaffected Marine patsy in a warehouse on an elevated floor above a presidential motorcade traveling at a slow pace below, with snipers hidden about the scene with telescopic rifles, and the patsy having gun and ammo in his possession. This is all almost eerily similar to what's going to happen in Dallas.
But it gets even more interesting. Just about the exact time JFK is scheduled to visit Chicago, half a world away in Vietnam, South Vietnamese President Diem and his brother are murdered in a CIA-sponsored plot. False CIA cables sent from Washington seemingly give Kennedy's okay for the assassination, even though he has ordered the CIA multiple times not to proceed in their request to kill Diem. Here is famed CIA agent E. Howard Hunt later testifying before a congressional committee about the false cables.
Just that I might be able to improve upon the record. And what did you understand him to mean when he said to improve upon the record?
To fabricate cables that could substitute for the missing chronological cables.
Did you in fact fabricate cables for the purpose of indicating the relationship of the Kennedy administration and the assassination at the end?
I did.
And did you show these fabricated cables to Mr. Colson?
I did.
It is easy to see that if Oswald did save the president's life in Chicago, he would try and do it again in Dallas. It is difficult for some to understand just what kind of men were really plotting to kill Kennedy. Not the anti-Castro Cubans who could be manipulated and positioned to do the actual act of pulling the trigger. No, the men who thought they controlled the world for their own avarice and greed, especially Allen Dulles. Here are just some of the operations Dulles created and oversaw. And every one of these overthrows of democratically elected governments installed dictatorships, and they led to thousands to hundreds of thousands of deaths of ordinary citizens. But all of these coups d'etats kept the dictators under CIA control and ensured that Dulles and his wealthy cabal would continue to exploit the wealth and natural resources of each of the countries.
And then they realized, the easy way to get people, to protect American business investments was to control foreign governments. And in Iran in 1953, the British had come and asked for help because Iran was making noises about nationalizing its oil that Britain was especially dependent on. U.S. was not, but Britain was. And so we worked with them to overthrow Mossadegh in Iran and install the Shah, who became a much hated figure, and the Ayatollah and the fundamentalism that we see in Iran today is a direct reaction to the Shah, who we put in, who is essentially a fascist, who ran the country like a dictator.
Flush with success with the Iran overthrow, the CIA almost immediately decided to overthrow President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman of Guatemala. The United Fruit Company, in which both Dulles brothers were major stockholders, owned hundreds of thousands of acres of land in Guatemala, along with the railroad system, the telegraph system, and controlled nearly all of the country's trade. When President Arbenz tried to diversify the country's agriculture and provide land for poor peasants, the Dulles brothers led the opposition, under the guise of worrying about a communist threat. The CIA's own website calls the agency's overthrow of President Arbenz one of its most shameful moments. In January of 1961, Allen Dulles ordered the overthrow of popular Congo President Patrice Lumumba, after he tried to stop the raping of his country's natural resources by Belgian and U.S. corporate interests. These corporations held a stranglehold on almost all resources in that country. Lumumba tried to establish a plan to redistribute wealth to poor, small landholders. On November 2, 1963, 3 weeks before Dealey Plaza, Dulles ordered the kidnapping and murder of the Diem brothers in Vietnam against the explicit orders of President Kennedy. Dulles' CIA wrote a fake cable pretending to be from President Kennedy ordering the Diem brothers' murder. How could Dulles and his CIA partners hope to get away with something so blatantly fake and demonstrably false? Because on the exact same day, November 2, 1963, Dulles had engineered an assassination of President Kennedy in Chicago. When Kennedy signed National Security Action Memo 263, pulling 1,000 advisors out of Vietnam by the end of 1963 and virtually all American military by the end of 1965, this was too much for Dulles and the corporate titans who had run American foreign policy for the decade before Kennedy was elected. There were hundreds of millions of dollars in profit to be made by a war in Southeast Asia, and Kennedy was not going to give them that war. So eliminating Oswald would serve two purposes. Primarily, his Mexico City trip would be manipulated 100 ways to appear Oswald was associating with Castro and that Castro participated in Kennedy's assassination. And secondly, it would eliminate Oswald, who by this time knew way too much and had even saved Kennedy from the wolves in Chicago. Dulles and Angleton didn't need or even want Oswald to go anywhere. They just needed a record of him associating with the Cubans and Soviets to justify their aims. And that aim was to assassinate President John Kennedy, and to cause enough doubt that Castro ordered the hit that they could rally the full forces of the U.S. military to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro once and for all. Remember, these CIA extremists and those like them, including two Air Force generals, Curtis LeMay and Thomas Power, stubbornly even opposed White House directives that reduced their authority to decide when to go nuclear. LeMay had counseled war with the Soviets just 1 year earlier in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, they had calculated that the Soviets would not interfere with a Cuban invasion that was caused by the assassination of the U.S. president by Fidel Castro. What happened during Oswald's visit to Mexico City is not difficult to understand. He went to the Cuban consulate and the Soviet embassy asking for a visa to travel to Cuba for 2 weeks and then on to the Soviet Union. He was told he needed a passport photo and some other things, and he made more visits and more phone calls to both the Cubans and the Soviets during the week he was there to discuss the problems he was having. That's it. It is impossible to believe Oswald could really have thought he was going to get clearance to travel that quickly. Frankly, it is ridiculous, and Oswald didn't want to travel anywhere. He had been ordered to make contact with the Cubans and Soviets and make sure he was remembered, and he did his job. And even though Oswald certainly didn't know it, the Mexico City office was much busier than him the week he visited. They placed fake Oswald calls to both the Cubans and the Soviets, and also photographed a fake Oswald, supposedly visiting those embassies. What should frighten everyone, even today, is that in one or more of those fake calls, the Oswald impersonator made it sound like he was a hired killer for the Soviets and invoked the name of Valery Kostakov, a Russian agent associated with assassinations. There was no doubt that some or all of this material would have been used to justify the Cuban invasion the CIA was planning after JFK's assassination. And everything may have worked out just fine for the CIA plan, except for one little item. Oswald did not die the day of the assassination as planned. He stepped off of the Marcellus Street bus, mired in traffic, and walked to get a cab. If he had stayed on that bus, he would have been shot by Captain William Westbrook and Reserve Officer Kenneth Croy of the Dallas Police, and the Mexico City CIA station would have provided just the right info on Oswald at just the right time to cement Cuban participation in the assassination. But Oswald defied the odds once again by escaping death in the Texas theater upon capture, and the CIA plan was foiled. Oswald was captured, allowing the FBI to interrogate him and compare his voice to the tapes of the taped phone calls, which were flown up from the CIA's Mexico City station the evening of the assassination. The CIA was caught in their own trap. Don't get caught on the web. The Mexico station will trade accusations with CIA Washington about who got when photos were taken, if there were photos or no photos, etc. The CIA station in Mexico City kept close tabs on the Soviet embassy, using multi-line phone taps, 3 photographic sites, a mobile surveillance team, and a mail intercept operation. But Scott and Goodpasture will lie repeatedly about cameras not working at all the whole week Oswald was there. The CIA was caught trying to explain their Oswald materials to the FBI, and there was no explanation for it. When Hoover made his well-known call to Lyndon Johnson and related that the CIA had sent photos and voice recordings of an imposter, he had to know what was going on. The fact that the imposter audio was implicating Oswald as working for the Soviets must have frightened Hoover greatly. He had to know right then what the CIA was up to. But Hoover made his decision. He would go along with the cover-up. He would go along with the lone nut shooter. Why he did may be argued, but he did.